How do you grow bigger, better, and more prolific berries? Well, it starts right now in the fall. So in this video, I'm going to take you around my garden with me to all my different berry plants and show you some simple tasks that I do to get them protected for the winter and to get them ready to grow and fruit like crazy next spring. Depending on what kind of berry you're talking about, obviously the different plants are going to need slightly different kinds of care. But this time of year, there are some common things that we're going to look for that's going to help prepare all of the plants for winter. So for one thing, we want to get rid of dead or diseased or spent growth. For another thing, this is a great time to concentrate on soil health and using different things to help improve the soil so that the plant is better prepared to grow next spring. And then also we're going to be looking for ways to protect the plants over the winter and prevent any sort of cold damage. And that's going to differ from fruit to fruit, so we'll be going through that as we go through. But first, let's get started with blackberries. For blackberries, the main thing you want to do this time of year is get rid of the spent canes. These are the canes like this one that had fruit growing on them this year. They're called floricanes. And as you can see, this time of year, it's super easy to tell what is still alive. These are the primocanes that are going to become fruiting canes next year, and what is now dead. And so the simple task is to remove the dead stuff. Now, my blackberries are summer-bearing blackberries, or they're also called floricane blackberries. And that means that they're going to grow fruit in the summer on 2-year-old growth, right? So the stuff that was new last year becomes this year's fruiting canes. There are also fall-bearing, or also called ever-bearing, blackberries and raspberries. Those have a little bit of a different pruning method. So right here, I'm going to show you what to do for the summer-bearing blackberries and raspberries and those sorts of bramble fruits. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about what to do for the fall-bearing plants. But for now, I'm going to get rid of this dead stuff all the way down at the base there. That's where I'm going to cut. I'm also going to look for things like this, where I have a live cane, but you can see this part of the branch broke. And I want to make a clean cut here. The reason it's so important to remove the dead growth this time of year is so that you don't have pests overwintering. I know that in the fall and in the winter, it's good to leave, for example, your perennial plants, their sort of dead sticks in the ground. It's good, you want those beneficial insects. Well, the problem with fruiting plants like blackberries and raspberries is if we leave that dead growth over the winter, you're more likely to attract bad pests that are going to cause all sorts of trouble for your crop next year. So for other perennials, you can leave some habitats for good bugs, but for these, we're going to get rid of the dead stuff. The rest of the pruning for blackberries and raspberries is going to wait until the end of the winter, right before spring begins and the plant starts growing again. So if you want to see more details about how to prune blackberries, I'm going to link to a video that I've done about that. I forgot to mention one more thing, which is that you don't have to wait until fall to prune away the dead growth on summer-bearing blackberries and raspberries. It's okay to go ahead and do it once the plant is done fruiting completely. Once you've picked that last berry, then you can go ahead and trim down all of the spent canes. I tend to wait a little bit later in the fall just because my growing season is really long. It's super hot and I don't want to stress out my plants. But you definitely don't want to wait too long because we don't want those pests to get comfy and make themselves at home in the dead growth. So if you haven't done it by now, fall's the time to do it. Other than pruning that dead growth out, that's pretty much it for blackberries, besides mulching, and we'll get back to that in just a second. But let's go over to my raspberry patch so we can talk a little bit more about fall-bearing raspberries and blackberries and what to do this time of year. Most raspberries that you get are fall-bearing, or they're also called ever-bearing. Now you can get summer-bearing raspberries. I actually have some, and if you are growing those, then pruning is basically the same as what I just showed you for the blackberries. You get rid of the dead growth that has already fruited, and you let this year's canes grow and continue, and those are the ones that'll fruit next year. So it's the same procedure. But for fall-bearing raspberries and blackberries, it's even simpler. All you have to do is cut down the plant once it goes dormant completely to the ground. And that is going to send a whole bunch of new growth up next year that'll be ready to give you a huge crop of berries next fall. There are actually a couple different ways you can prune. That's my preferred way to get one bigger harvest in the fall, but if you want to spread out your raspberry harvest, you can leave a few of this year's canes to overwinter and become second-year canes next year, and those are going to flower and fruit sooner in the summer. So you'll end up with a smaller crop of berries in the summer and a smaller crop in the fall. So it sort of just depends on what you want, but it really is as simple as that. Don't grab your pruning shears just yet though. This is actually not the right time of year to do this type of pruning. For one thing, my fall bearing raspberries are still bearing fruit. I have a little bit more to pick, but you also want to wait until the plant is dormant. So I like to wait to cut down my raspberry plants until the end of winter. The plants are totally dormant, and when it's getting closer for that spring growth to start again. So hold off, don't prune yet, but at least you know the procedure now, and you can prune any summer bearing blackberries and raspberries. Now let's talk about what you can do to protect your raspberries and blackberries and all of those bramble plants from the cold. Most raspberries and blackberries are going to do just fine over the winter in most areas, but if you live somewhere with a really cold winter, or if you're trying to grow blackberries and raspberries just past their zonal range and you're trying to kind of stretch it, there are some things you can do to protect them over the winter and keep them from getting cold damage. The simplest thing to do is to unhook them from whatever trellis system you're using, lay them on the ground, and this works especially well for vining varieties like this one that I've got here. Just lay them on the ground, then you can pile up mulch on top to keep them warm and insulate them, and even as the snow falls, it'll make this really great protective blanket. You can also use frost cloth, and you just leave that on, tuck them in for the winter, and then once things start to warm up in the spring, right at the end of winter, before your spring growth really gets going, so around the time of your last frost, you uncover them, you re-hook them up, and they should be ready to go in the spring. One thing I do for all of my berry plants in the fall, raspberries and blackberries, strawberries, everything, is mulch. So the first step of that is weeding really well, making sure that there's no other little weeds competing with the plants. But then I always like to put down a pretty thick layer of fresh mulch. There are a lot of ways to do this. My favorite way is the free way, which is to just rake up leaves and pine needles around my yard. I run them over with the lawnmower to shred them up, and then I spread that around my beds, and that works as a really great mulch. It insulates, it doesn't compact too much, it has good airflow, and it's free. And don't worry, I still have plenty of leaves and pine needles left over to mow and mulch around my lawn and in my other garden beds. I don't use them all up. I have plenty to go around because it's just great organic material to add in the soil. But yeah, it enhances the soil, it helps protect the roots over the winter, and it breaks down and adds good stuff into the ground so that the plants can use it next spring. But also, speaking of mulch, let's now talk about strawberry plants. There are a lot of really important things to do for strawberry plants this time of year. They need often winter protection depending on your climate. Mine's pretty mild, so they'll probably be okay, but in most cases you really want to protect them from the cold. We also need to work on the soil, add some good stuff, and just do a couple other maintenance things. So let's talk about it. The first step is to go through and get rid of any diseased or damaged leaves that you see. The idea is to keep any sort of disease from spreading. So if you see insect damage or if you see other disease, remove those individual leaves, or if you need to, you can pull out an entire plant. And the idea is to keep things from overwintering and spreading next year. Another thing to do is look for places where runners have spread. So that's how strawberry plants propagate. They send out these runners that eventually root into the ground and become a whole new plant. So if you have strawberry plants that have done that, and mine have, I only had like 5 plants in this whole bed when I planted them, and now we have this in just 1 year. But look for places where the plants are still attached by those runners and clip the runners. We want each plant to have its own energy to put toward flowering and fruiting. You don't want the mother plant wasting all of its energy trying to support support these other plants and send out new runners. So go ahead and clip those runners, give each plant a chance on its own. Another thing to look for this time of year before we get them all tucked in for the winter is anywhere that the plants seem really crowded. You may have to dig down a bit to see how far apart the plants are. They should be at least 4 to 6 inches apart, or another way to look at it is maybe 4 or 5 plants every square foot and no more crowded than that. So if you see areas where the plants are growing a little bit too close together, thin them out. It may seem painful now, but you will thank me next spring when you have more bigger, more luscious strawberries. Once you've done that, you want to clear out any weeds, any other debris. I have a lot of fallen leaves that I just want to make sure. Leaves are okay, you know, it makes good mulch, it makes good soil conditioner, but you want to make sure to get rid of anything that's diseased or problematic. I do have a lot of weeds. I also have some companion plants that I'm just going to let do their thing. There's some borage and chives in here. Those can stay, but other weeds we're going to clear out in preparation for mulching. You can also fertilize this time of year if it's not too close to your last frost. You don't want to fertilize when the plants are getting ready to go dormant. That would cause problems because if they start growing again, then that is more likely to be damaged by the cold. But if it's a little earlier in the fall, or if your weather's really mild like mine, you can spread just maybe a nice balanced fertilizer, or perhaps one with a little bit more potassium in it, because that's going to help them be a little bit hardier over the winter. It can be a good time to add a slow release fertilizer that's going to just enhance the soil and make the plants even stronger for winter. After that, it's time to mulch. Mulching is super important for strawberries over the winter. But before you start, wait a second, because you don't want to do it too soon. You want to give the plants a chance to adapt to the colder temperatures first. So it's November for me. It's still like in the low 70s right now. We're having a really warm fall. I'm not going to mulch my plants yet. I'm going to wait till things get colder, maybe even past the first frost, depending on how the weather goes, but before it gets too far below freezing. So the idea is to adapt them to the cold, get them ready to signal them going dormant. Then spread a nice thick layer of mulch to insulate the plants. In colder climates, go ahead and bury them because you want to keep them safe. They can be really sensitive to frost. You want to keep those crowns from getting cold damage. So use a material like straw is really common for strawberries, or since I have an abundance of pine needles, that's what I will be using. And the good thing about something like that is that you can pile them up really high, but they don't get too heavy and they don't compact too much. They stay nice and light and airy, and they stay like that for a long time. I would avoid piling up leaves because when leaves break down, they get really kind of soggy and they can trap moisture and cause all sorts of problems for the plants underneath, and we don't want that. So stay with something really lightweight when you mulch your strawberry plants. Now I'm over here by my blueberry plants, and there's just a couple things to worry about with these in the fall. So for one thing, you know, the big thing with blueberries is they have to be grown in really acidic soil between 4 and 6 on the pH scale. So fall is the time that you want to do a soil test and see if your pH is right. So I have already done this. I did a soil test that told me my pH was okay, but riding a little high. The reason you do this time of year is because if you need to make adjustments by adding sulfur, which is what you would use to acidify soil, then now is the time to do it, because elemental sulfur, any of the types of sulfur take time to be broken down in the soil and actually affect the pH. So if you're going to use a soil acidifier, the one that I use is or at least the one that I've used recently on these plants is the Espoma soil acidifier, because it's a little bit more gentle. I only recommend it if you need to make a small change. There are other more concentrated products that you can use if you're trying to make a bigger pH change. But you use it this time of year because it needs to break down over time, and it takes a few months for it really to make a difference in the pH of the soil. So follow the package instructions, adjust as needed, but make sure you do it this time of year before the plants start growing again in the spring. And just like all of the other plants, mulching is the other important thing for blueberries. Just like over the summer, you want to keep the soil moisture consistent. You also want to help insulate the roots from cold damage and just minimize the temperature fluctuations in the soil and protect the shallow roots of the blueberry plant. So to do that, keep a few good inches of mulch on the plant at all times. And so I find I need to reapply in the fall. Just like I described with the other plants, often I use the pine needle and leaf mixture this time of year. You can use pine bark, you can use a mixture of various ingredients, whatever you have on hand, but the most important thing is to protect the plants over the winter. The last of the berry plants that I want to show you is elderberries. And I wanted to end on this one because it's the easiest one. So what are the things you need to do for elderberry plants over the winter and in the fall to get ready for winter? Nothing. Basically, you don't need to do anything except perhaps do the same thing as we've been talking about. Do a little weeding and maybe another layer of mulch if you need to, just to make sure everything's nice and insulated. But elderberries are super resilient and they're really hardy over the winter. It's not time to prune yet. That's better at the end of winter if you're going to do any pruning, which they don't even technically need. You can just kind of let them do their thing. So if you're not already growing elderberries, you might want to try it because they're one of the easiest fruits you can grow. I don't know about y'all, but fall is a super busy time of year for me and my family. And that is why it's really important to me to keep things as simple, efficient, and easy to do as possible in the garden this time of year. So just remember that these quick tasks to check off your list really just boil down to getting rid of dead stuff, helping to nourish the soil for next year, and just protecting the plants from the cold. And that's really all it comes down to. So keep it as quick and simple as possible, just like I've shown you in this video. By the way, I do have another similar video all about things you can do for fruit trees this time of year to prep them for the winter and for next growing season, so I will link to that. But in the meantime, you know, more or less, once you've done those quick tasks, you can just let the plants do their thing, conserve their energy, and they will be ready to grow and fruit better than ever for you next year. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.